The university, which is book, well, is more connected to Latin America, and the second is more global. The first one is more about Latin America, and the second most global. It has different chapters, different continents, and many experiences. It's broken down in different parts. One part is community work with peace. Another one has to do with justice and peace, with transitional justice and peace. And I recommend this because it has a diversity of work, and because the other one, because its scope is Latin America. So I advertise this because I know that they are interrelated. The agenda, I will be talking about the research lines, the research and the challenges. This model is what has guided my concern in research and peace. So my goal was to investigate about the actors. Something that I started to question about was my PhD thesis some years ago. It's what's the role of media in this, of mass media. Here we have talked about the media, but the thing is, how much media research have we done about what the media does? So there is a full line of mass media and how they have framed the conflict, forgiveness, reconciliation, how the media, and if there is difference, the kind of language the media use. Then we have done research with thousands of data, a follow-up of the media to show things. My PhD thesis was follow-up to what had happened between, well, in the time, the negotiation with the paramilitary, how they have framed the paramilitary work with the mass media, in particular with El Tiempo. It was thousands of data because I took an entire year and to take a look at that. But after that, I started to ask more questions. What do the elite think about the speech that the elite does about the peace? What do they think that before the plebiscite, what they started to do, how the Channel News had a kind of discourse and Caracol had another kind, and there were differences. But in addition to that, I was wondering about other topics. So here, yeah, the word forgiveness. And then I started to question people who would sell actually forgiveness courses, classes, and groups. And I understand that. I think that is very good. So that is a forgiveness. And it happens that I see that there were religious statements about forgiveness. So I would find some legal statements about forgiveness and the role of traditional justice, but nobody would ask people what forgiveness means. So I'm going to show the research lines in forgiveness, and the other thing is that one thing is investigating forgiveness in different actors. Is the same for a former combatant or for somebody who is in one place or another within the actors? Is it the same for a victim that for somebody who's not a victim? Forgiven or reconciliation? So I started to ask that, and here you will see that there are many methodologies. All of these are diverse in quantitative, qualitative. Here I connected to a professor called Etimolet, where I have learned a lot because he worked forgiveness in different contexts of the word. But it's basically I call him methodology of research per scenarios, but they call it like a different way. And I started to ask questions and to see consequences. And the last thing that we have is with Pablo. We are in two projects, one in Montes de Maria on mental health, building with that community or building with them this issue of mental health, uh, having different actors to dialogue, conversate, like the mental health actors, the communities, and the other one about forgiveness from the neuroscientific point of view. And in this research, I started to differentiate that it was not the same to forgive somebody who has been the victim of a massacre from sexual violence. Each one of the things could make a difference. So my question was, is there a difference? And on the other hand, we see all the issues of transitional justice that I call them psychosocial processes, whether actually the truth. So just we're going to see that from the point of view, legal point of view of the implications, or are we going to see that as a psychological topic, how people sees that? So I start asking myself a lot of questions. So we have nationwide research with one of my PhD students in the Javeriana and working in his PhD to have a nationwide analysis. When I talk to the event organizers, I would tell them, what do you want me to show? And they were asking, they asked me to show the broad spectrum of what you have done. So this is what I'm gonna try to do. I understand the psychosocial dimension like this, and this comes from Wolfram Brenner's psychology point of view, but I manage it like this. I think that we have to research in all these levels. Here, the prior research talk a lot about intergroup, outgroup, so that's why you will see a lot of a variety of studies in that direction. This is one of the studies, and here you will always see the article published. In general, most of them are published associated to the speech or discourse and political violence. So how we legitimize the political actor or delegitimize, and in each case, how the FARC and the autodefensas of the paramilitary were legitimized or not. So we didn't call them paramilitary back then because there had been some issues with some journals that they didn't understand, or some reviewers who said that in Colombia there was no conflict. That's what they answered, or they would say that the paramilitary would mean that the military were, and that needed a proof. So we were rejected articles. So
And in this case, the result, the most important finding was clear, and is that the speeches or the narrative of FARC and the paramilitaries, we found that they delegitimized the same that we found in the previous research. They used dehumanization, naturalization of violence, justification of violence, asymmetry of suffering. Some suffer more than others. So this might seem obvious, but when I started this wasn't obvious. It wasn't even investigated. This is another study on the types of stereotypes tied to the legitimation of political violence, and we conducted this study on university population. And this was a question this morning: those who are not a victim directly, because, for example, many in the university population were not directly victims. So why? What explains their position? So what type of categories they use to legitimize or delegitimize actors? And for example, remember the campaigns of the army of Colombian heroes. I'm not sure if you remember. Those who are older remember that, but that disappeared. But it was a strategy. They hired media agencies to develop a narrative to portray the army as heroes, and then the others, they don't exist. They're just criminals, and we had to support the country, and we saw that. What was the army? And we hadn't learned of the false positive scandals. So many of those things would change today. But we know that people are reluctant to change despite learning about the false positive. There's another ongoing research in Medellin about a professor. It's called Gaps for Peace that I mentioned this morning, in which you can clearly see that there are regions in which people said that FARC were the sole responsibles for everything, that the false positives or extrajudicial killings by the army was made up, that is part of a political leftist agenda from the Truth Commission and the transitional justice system. That's what they say. And that's been a mistake because that has impact on the legitimacy of that society gives to some relevant actors. That's another study. It's also about beliefs in the speech of in the Pastrana administration. How that speech of the elites, for example, during the Pastrana administration, what type of strategies they used when they were negotiating, and how the administration never modified its speech in the midst of the negotiation. Even though they were negotiating, they kept calling the other ones and using a speech that was delegitimizing the other party. This becomes relevant when you think about legitimization and delegitimization processes. These remember that these articles are publicly accessible, and if you cannot find them, you may come to me. These are the researchers' website. This is another one about the speech of the narrative of the paramilitary groups and the government regarding paramilitaries. And we have findings. Language plays a core role in the escalation of conflict and in the construction of the imagery of the opposite. So this is important because I want you to remember that we stopped doing research for many years about public or audiences. And who ended up doing those studies? Businesses, market research agencies, but universities left aside audience studies or public studies because it is not a coincidence that the five largest media are owned by five large business enterprises. That's not a coincidence, but they actually know that audiences and media outlets play a key role in shaping the way in which people react cognitively and emotionally regarding the conflict. So linguistic expressions may be perceived as psychological indicators, high correlations of psychological states and expression of regular expressions. We saw that words, for example, the software that have been built lately are wonderful and they allow you to manage thousands of data points. Before it used to be manual, now you can manage millions of data points, which creates more consistency because before when you turn to data and you find a pattern, you see this is not a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence that paramilitarism, when they were negotiating, the El Tiempo journal tried to legitimize. And what strategies did they use? What were the language that they were using? Where they used it? And I'm sorry to say it, but it happened. And that was my PhD thesis actually, and it was published in the chapter of a book. This is the type of words, the number of words, just to show the corpus. 3 million words. We use large samples of speech and the type of forms to present that speech, and we compare the different perceptions in national and foreign media. When, for example, a president said something here and outside they said something else. These are the types of the study of language. And this is the type of analysis that you start finding. These are factorial analysis using this where the closeness of words, the type of speech, allow to differentiate the two. For example, this is before and after the referendum. What happened before and after the negotiation process if some changes had been produced. So a positive image arose, and if diverse media were portraying that to collaborate with that. We know that no, we know that large media outlets during the negotiation process with the FARC, they played a role without openly saying it. They tried to bias all their speech in one way or another, and that could be detected in this data analysis. This is uh, when we deal about forgiveness. This is what do people understand as forgiveness? What are their confusions? For example, sometimes people think that forgiveness and reconciliation are the same thing, but these are two different concepts that we need to distinguish. And we might understand this in a scholarly context. And I have found scholars that don't find the distinction. But these are two different concepts. And remember, there was a moment in which people pushed victims to forgive, and there were even campaigns and ads. That was absurd. But it's become part of the confusion, of the unfortunate confusion of trying to do everything in social sciences and in psychology. But then we don't have a scope, a well-defined scope. Even though we have the best intentions, we end up not accomplishing our goals. So I said we need to combine qualitative studies with quantitative studies. Here's a study that was published regarding the notions of forgiveness and reconciliation, how people understood those two concepts. These are some of the findings. This was published in the Social Studies magazine, and we work with internal displacement victims, for example. Here we found 4 groups. This was also qualitative research on victims of internal forced displacement in Bogotá. And here we started comparing, and we did 2 studies, one in 2011 when we were in the midst of the peace process with the paramilitaries, and another one in 2016 when we were negotiating with FARC. Why is that important? Because we wanted to see how things change, how things evolved, and that was the type of questions, that's the type of scenario that we included in the design. It becomes like an octagon. And Luis Ramos is a former member of the guerrilla, is an actor, and I wanted to see if people was more willing to forgive one actor than another. The other one was a paramilitary, the other one was an army member, and the other one a common thief. Could people perhaps forgive easier a common thief? And then the type of crime. Here, for example, death. Then it was planned by senior commanders, or they executed. Because one thing is to act on orders, and another thing is to, some people say I just followed an order, and there was a huge controversy with Nazis. I was just following orders. And if they ask for forgiveness, if that variable caused willingness or not to forgive. So we modified the variables. It became very complex because every time you change a factor, the others change, and statistically it becomes complex, but these studies were actually great. But the willingness to forgive was very low. There was a lot of unwillingness to forgive, and the samples were large, 600, 700 people, and willingness to forgive goes down. We knew that it was easy to lose that referendum because willingness to forgive was very low, because the media speech wasn't leading that way. So when the referendum, when it was lost, many people even cried. But if you looked at the data from this study, it was very easy for a slight change in a speech from an actor, and that was actually the strategy of the No campaign. They disseminated a speech. Another interesting fact, and this was published in a magazine called, this is a social indicator magazine. Not only willingness to forgive was low, but the groups, those that were unwilling to forgive, were low, 40%. But something interesting is that people was willing to forgive zero to military. There was no willingness to forgive militaries. So that raises a lot of questions. The emotional relation that was built with the military through all those media campaigns, now it backfired because it wasn't easy to forgive them. And that was from 2016 to 2017, years later. And I think that's great because it's not easy to compare two different historical moments in this type of research. We also published this in Peace and Conflict, and this is all the data that it revealed, depending on the circumstance. But the fact is that the second study showed that there was a low willingness to forgive, even though paramilitaries and then the guerrilla, it went up slightly, willingness to forgive in 2016. If you remember, many campaigns was geared around forgiveness and the speech towards FARC as the great enemy, but it varied a little bit. I want to clarify that. And this is, let me know how much time I have left. Oh wow. This I want to mention, this one. We built this one with former combatants that were about to release from prison to see how they perceived reconciliation, and this is gonna be interesting based on another qualitative research with former combatants of FARC who were already in concentration zones because it provided inputs on how they conceived reconciliation and how easy it or feasible it was. And as a general note, why people were asking why are people still calling people FARC? But FARC knew that if they kept their name, the name was relevant for their combatants. Sometimes you think that is random, but actually it wasn't. I even talked in Cuba when I visited with one of these chiefs about this, and we reached that conclusion. There's many data, and then I started researching on issues, for example, about truth, how much it weight, and truth is actually an issue. People don't want to know the truth. It's not easy for them to want to know the truth. And the research that we did is both in large and small samples. And that's why the effort of the Truth Commission is hard because people actually, knowing the truth, it's hard. It's not simple. Other anger feelings, we did this the same with corruption and with drug policy because we wanted to investigate those processes that are embedded into the conflict. And for example, the drug issue, during the Santos administration, the Ministry of Justice used this study as an input to substantiate public policy. Remember, they tried to change public policy. I was invited to a forum because the drug issue is a core one. It's a core issue, and people said that the drug against drugs was useless, but there had not been research asking people if they actually what they actually believed about the drug policy. They asked people in the elite, but I said no. Let's do a large, ask the public massively scale, and the people think that the war against drug doesn't work, and that becomes a resource that you may ignore it, but it's a resource. These are the latest studies that are comparing these media outlets to see how they conceive forgiveness and reconciliation, and if there were variations, and there were. And the last thing is trying to study how they handle the issue of social leaders, and it's scary. This is at a national level, the Truth Commission and the Transitional Justice System, and this is on how we assess transitional justice. I'm about to be done, and I think we need to have a vision because I have why have I tried to provide all these perceptions? Because sometimes people with good intentions they do one small thing, then another one, but there's no articulation. But we need to have a comprehensive, articulated approach that it's more ecological. And the lack of an ecosystem approach to the problem, sometimes researchers get lost, even those that design interventions, because they say this fragment work for this, but not for anything else. So we need to have a multi-dimensional vision because there are political, economical, social, cultural, and other variables. It's a whole ecosystem, and we gotta approach this from a cross-disciplinary perspective, which is beyond a cliche. There's actually differences between groups and biopsychosocial. We lack a biopsychosocial vision, and that has had effects because many people that work in social sciences are biased and they don't see the details of what's going on. So yeah, we may issue many statements, but we don't have data. So we lose legitimization regarding public policy makers which were against this process. I want to clarify that if you were looking for funds, this is a collage. Thank you, Juan, of the articles. Once again, thank you.